Hi everybody. Well, our task in this video is to look in some detail at the first two major theories of religion that we will cover in this course. Already through the reading from Strensky, we've met Jean Bodin, an early theorist of religion, as well as Herbert of Cherbury. Both had a significant interest in religion. They advanced the conversation. But the two figures we'll look at today developed full-blown systematic theories of religion, theories that would go on to influence the later theorists, whose work we will be considering, and to have a really significant influence on the culture. The two figures I speak of here are E.B. Tylor and James Frazer. We'll be following the discussion, as we will throughout the course, from Daniel Powell's book, 9 Theories of Religion. So let's get started. It's useful to begin by considering some of the common themes between Tylor and Frazer, because you might say, well, why are we looking at two people together? The reason is that they influenced each other. In fact, Frazer got interested in religion precisely because of Tylor's book, Primitive Culture, and they worked at around the same time, and they're both contributors to the field of anthropology in different ways, a social scientific study of religion. So they're not personally interested in religion and just thinking it through. They are professors, both of them ultimately, focused on the study of religion in a way that they regard as, and that's our first point here, fully scientific. So we might look today at this work from the 1870s, 1880s, and we might think, well, that's very early, or that's not entirely, serious or peer-reviewed, we might say today. However, from the point of view of Tylor and Frazer, they were engaged in a thoroughly, fully scientific pursuit. The contrast case here is theology, or traditional ways of approaching the study of religion. They are explanations of religion that might rely on supernatural agents or causes, right? Not for Tylor and Frazer. Natural only, right? Natural here means the kind of thing that you can look at in a laboratory, something you can empirically observe. This is how they distinguished their approach to the study of religion, or their approaches from previous approaches. And they used a mountain of evidence. The works that we're going to be talking about, especially James Frazer's book, The Golden Bough, we can't even call it a book. This is a multi-volume, massive project. I think he calls at one point an adventure of discovery. We don't produce books like this much anymore, but these thinkers both did. That's the first common theme, then, that I would identify based on the chapter from Powell's, that they both see their views as fully scientific. Another similarity. Both of them are focused on the origins of religion. They want to identify what is the simplest form of religion that we can determine existed on the basis of evidence, and then how can we follow through that simple form to later, more complex forms, right? So they're interested in the evolution of religion. And it's not accidental, perhaps, that their work was done soon after the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, right? So the evolution was all the rage at this time. And the conviction was that you can understand complexity by getting back to the simple form and then just tracing it forward, right? They approach religion in that way. Third and finally, they're both inclined to approach religion as a matter of what an individual believes. So religion is about belief, right? There are certain questions. We're looking for answers to those questions, and religion provides those answers. They're leaving aside then, what do I have on the slide here? Group needs, feelings, structures, rituals, practices. This kind of thing they see as secondary, right? The important thing is, what claims does the religion make about reality, about truth? And that's what they focus on. So let's see how this plays out first in E.B. Tylor, say a little bit more about his life and work, and then in the work of James Frazer. So Tylor's book is Primitive Culture. We'll say a little bit more about that. He wrote several books, but that's the lasting one and the one with which we'll be concerned. He was born in 1832, died in 1917, and as Powell's puts it, he was a self-educated Englishman who never attended a university, but through his travels and independent study arrived at the theory of animism. Animism, about which more presently. His education then, not formal, remarkably, I mean, this is not something that would happen today for better or for worse. His education consisted primarily of a trip to Central America when he was 23. He engaged in study there of local peoples and what we would call today anthropological evidence, archaeological evidence included in that. And the work that he did on the basis of that trip earned him finally a position as a professor of anthropology at Oxford. Now, it's worth noting that we today take for granted that the social sciences kind of have always been with us, right? That is not the case. E.B. Tylor founded anthropology. Right? Before E.B. Tylor, there was no social scientific field called anthropology. You say the same thing about Auguste Comte and some of the earlier 19th century social scientific thinkers. The very idea of a social science is something that was kind of new and radical and strange, right? The idea that you could study human beings in the same way you study rocks and plants and trees, right? There are philosophical questions connected with that, right? What about human freedom, right? What about, we've talked about the difference between interpretation and explanation. Maybe we need to be interpreting human life and explaining physical, natural things, right? Social science says something different and to great effect over time. What Tylor does in approaching religion, okay, so he's founded anthropology. Now he's going to look at the anthropology of religion. Who's on the field? Max Muller. We've had Max Muller already. He challenges Muller's focus on language, right? He says, okay, Sanskrit, kind of etymology work, it's the history of words and language. That's very interesting, Muller, but that's not really going to explain religion. What's going to explain religion is, he says, ethnography and ethnology, the study of peoples, the study of cultures, right? And he wants to lay the basis, and this is anthropology for him, for a science of culture, right? He wants to approach the study of culture not in a kind of interpretive, hermeneutical, it's a term we've used before, soft kind of way. He wants evidence and he wants to establish truths about the nature of human cultures in that way. In the pursuit of this, he does what anybody founding a science might be expected to do. He identifies laws, right? Scientific laws. He calls them the two great laws of culture in his book, Primitive Culture, published in 1871. What are these two laws? Okay, number one, I'll read it a bit. The principle of psychic unity or uniformity within the human race. First try. Second try. The fundamental uniformity of the human mind. I won't read the third one. Listen, here's the idea. If we come to some conclusion today, right? We might say, okay, that's a rational conclusion. It's based on the evidence, right? And we might look at the distant past. I'm talking here about 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, right? And we might say, well, we today have rationality, but people at that time, they were irrational, right? They just believed random stuff, unscientific. Tylor says that is not the case. When we look back at 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, those folks were operating rationally. They had very different evidence than we have. They had far less evidence than we have, and therefore their reason led them to quite different conclusions. However, the process that they went through, same as the process we went through. This is crucial because if you can't believe, let's say, that there's a consistency of rationality, in this case, over time, then how can you draw conclusions about the human past? You can't, because maybe they just were doing some random things. The same thing with physics, right? If we think that the law of gravity applies only on Earth, right, and nowhere else, or only in the solar system and nowhere else, that's a problem, because we therefore cannot draw any conclusions about what is happening outside of the Earth or the solar system, right? Our laws of gravity they don't apply. Who knows what's happening over there? No, for physics, you need to have that uniformity of, in that case, physical causation, right? If I hit one thing, it's gonna react the same on Earth, on Mars, on Venus, in space. I mean, accounting for the difference of conditions in those locations. Same thing that Tyler's saying. Number two, the pattern of intellectual evolution or improvement over time is something he focuses on. Continuing, when two societies are seen to diverge, it is because one must be higher and the other lower on the scale of cultural evolution. Okay, you got society A, society B. Society A comes first, society B later, right? There's some history of interaction between these societies. What Tyler says is there is going to be, just as there's a uniformity of mind, there's going to be a continuity of development, right? And this is just as Darwin was claiming about the evolution of species over time. Tyler is claiming about intellectual evolution, right? Later ideas develop on the basis of earlier ideas. Examples of this. He calls them survivals. Think about God bless you. We say it. We say it in class. God bless you, right? Why do we say God bless you? I mean, we have lots of different kind of folk stories about this. One that I've heard is, in the book of Genesis, we'll go back to that, God forms a human being out of mud and breathes the breath of life, ruach in Hebrew, right? He breathes the breath of life into that thing. Now, when you sneeze, all the breath goes out of you. And folk tale, it used to be believed that when all of the air left your system, it was susceptible to malicious powers, right? Demons and such things. Your spirit is, as it were, out of your body and in the world, right? And so you're blessing the person for that reason. That's something I heard. Maybe you've heard it too. But that is an example of what Tyler means by that uniformity of mind, right? So people don't say God bless you for kind of random reasons. They believe certain things about the world. Your breath is your spirit. It is safe in your body. It is unsafe outside of your body. And therefore, we bless you when you sneeze, right? For a very practical and, on that account, rational reason. Tyler thinks this is one of countless, he calls them survivals, things that we still do, but yet the basis for doing so doesn't really exist anymore. Like, why do we say God bless you? And perhaps you don't believe that specific thing about the human spirit leaving the body, but you still say it. We can explain, he thinks, these survivals by the principle of uniformity. We can enter, as we have on the slide here, the minds of people in other cultures and try to understand why they believed what they did, right? So again, folks in other cultures, previous cultures, long ago, tens of thousands of years ago cultures, were acting rationally. And so long as we have that principle of uniformity of mind, we can trace things in our own culture, in many cases, back to those earlier cultures. Let's get on about religion. We've referred already to animism, right? And let's start with this. Tyler defines religion very simply. That's why I put it as the first bullet point. Religion is belief in spiritual beings. That's what religion is, right? If I believe there is a supernatural personality with whom I can have commerce, I can talk, pray, hope, interact, and this kind of thing, I'm religious. If I don't believe there are spiritual beings, personal agencies in the world, then I am not religious, right? This is a pretty narrow definition of religion, in fact. I mean, we're going to see with Durkheim and others, religion is much more broadly, capaciously defined. But for Tyler, it comes down to this, belief in spiritual beings. Earlier in human cultures, according to his account, human beings believed, that every living thing had a soul, an anima. And that's not a wild belief on his part. Aristotle's famous work, De Anima, on the soul, kind of an early work of what we would call today psychology, identifies plants, animals, people, everything had a soul. This was the life principle. This was the form of the thing, right? And then when we die, for Aristotle, the soul kind of dissolves. This was a problem for Christian theology receiving Aristotle, by the way, because he didn't believe in the eternality of the soul. Leave that aside. Okay, so this idea that there are spirits in every living thing is well established. How does Tylor explain the emergence of this belief? Since we said origins are important, he proposes a historical point of origin. Quote from Pals: "From their vivid encounters with both death and dreams, early peoples reasoned first to a simple theory of their own lives, that each of us is animated by a soul, a spiritual principle, and as souls animate persons, so spirits animate the world." Okay, someone is living, they die. It's very sad. Their body remains, but their self, their personality, their spirit, their person is no longer present, departs, as it were. Same thing with dreams, right? In my mind, in my dream, I experience, my spirit or soul experiences this kind of transportation, this whole other world. However, my body does not move. So the separation between soul and body is, for Tylor, not just some random thing that people thought up. They were reasoning on the basis of the evidence they had, and they came to that conclusion. He calls this system of thought animism, anima being the Latin word for soul. This chain of reasoning, he thinks, starts with animism, right? And then it kind of moves forward and develops. That's that evolution. So Poseidon, he thinks, okay, it becomes this, god of Olympus, and all these stories develop around Poseidon. He's in a relationship with all these other gods. All of this comes from an initial belief that there is a spirit of the sea, right? Evolves, evolves, evolves. Against Mueller, he says, and we saw Mueller last week, he thinks, religion arises kind of almost linguistically, like people just think it's like the reason we have gender in many languages, masculine and feminine nouns. For Mueller, that is a point of origin for religion. And for Tylor, no, it comes from this reasoning process. He argues directly and explicitly against Mueller on that point. The trouble, he thinks, and here he's in line with certain other thinkers of that time, like Friedrich Nietzsche in an interesting way, the moral or ethical principles associated with religion, period, or even with earlier forms of religion like animism, stay. We still have those principles. We still uphold them. We believe they're important. However, we no longer necessarily have the same beliefs about the world, and the spirits and things, that these earlier primitive peoples had. And that's a social problem and very interesting. We'll be looking at that kind of question later in the course. And so, in sum, for Tylor, and then you'll be able to take a break in just a moment. You could take a break right now if you want. In sum, religion is itself a survival for Tylor. It is a leftover from an earlier stage of human rational development, right? It arose rationally based on the evidence we have. Now we have better evidence, and yet, we kind of still remain religious a bit, but it's just a leftover, right? It remains with us in the same way and for the same reasons as the habit of saying God bless you, right? So people talk about God with respect for the same reason they automatically say God bless you. And one can anticipate that for Tylor, within decades or centuries, that habit and that belief will finally recede, will cease to be held as culture evolves. Second, religion was in the past just a primitive form of science. That's the takeaway point for Tylor. It's a scientific theory of religion, and religion emerged for scientific reasons. It's a rational way to try to understand the world, right? But knowing what we know about science, we can no longer rationally believe in gods. So this is the 19th century, and we might have a sense that, everybody was religious in the 19th century. Not so, right? At this time, there is a tidal wave of criticism of what we would call today organized religion, right? And Tylor is himself explaining religion away. James Frazer. Let's move on to our second theory. If you need to get a cup of coffee, now is the time. Born in 1854, died in 1941, so he's about 20 years or so younger than Tylor. He was, pals, a shy, scholarly Scotsman who spent virtually all of his life in a book-lined apartment at Cambridge University. If you want to picture Frazer's life, picture a study in Cambridge. A study meaning like a room with books on the wall, right? Books on the wall. This is a study I'm sitting in. Frazer did not leave his study. He did not conduct experiments. He did not do field work. He did not do research of that kind. He read books, right? He had access to a great fund of information at this time. British Empire, right? British Empire. All this resources, treasures, money, wealth is coming from all around the world into England, right? And Cambridge is not far from London. The capital of England is a kind of a center of the agglomeration of all of this new information, new for people in England. And Frazer is just a kid in a candy shop. Is that right? Or toy store? I don't know. He's happy with all of the things he has, and he wants to understand how they all fit together. How does the story from Russia connect with the story from Sumatra, connect with the story from the Congo, etc. Right? He's looking at the whole globe and trying to figure out what's the principle, right? What holds all this together? He was not himself religious. Same for Tylor, by the way, not religious, right? So these are theorists of religion, but they're not religious. But he was very interested in religion from an intellectual point of view. So he was a classicist. A classicist. That means he read Greek and Latin texts and memorized them and studied them and analyzed them. And it'd be a classicist today just as much as then. But for him, the real turn came when he read E.B. Tylor's book, Primitive Culture, right? So this is what opened his mind beyond the texts in his study and led him to begin seeking out from others empirical evidence to support a larger theory. He begins, and he's working with the work of a different scholar here, Robertson Smith, whom we're not going to go into in the course. But he was interested at first in ancient Hebrew religion, so Judaism, right? He's interested in the history of Christianity. Where did Christianity come from? And he begins making a comparison. This is what we call comparative religion, right? Something you maybe thought you would study in college, and you kind of are. He compares the tribal totemism that he observed, or others observed, in modern Arabia with ancient Hebrew practices. So we have certain kinds of sacrifice occurring in the temple in Jerusalem, other kinds of sacrifice occurring in other traditions in that region. We say, oh, maybe there's a connection between these two. We'll come back to this point about connections, right? As Powell's put it here, a lengthy quote in the second bullet point, totem use was associated with the tribal custom of dividing into different clans or kinship groups. Each of these clans commonly attached itself to a specific animal, or occasionally a plant, which it recognized as its totem. According, it worshiped as a kind of divinity. So we've seen a totem pole. Wes Anderson has a great movie that features a totem pole, right? Each of those faces on the totem pole is a totem. And a totem is an animal or a plant, as it says on the slide, that kind of represents the people or group or clan or kin group, right? We're going to see a lot about this when we get to Durkheim. But this really fascinated Frazer and got him thinking about, together with Tylor's book, anthropology and the relation between different ancient traditions beyond just the Greek and Latin speaking world. His big book, again, can't even call it a book. This is 20 volumes, huge. It's a shelf. It's not a book, right? It's called The Golden Bough. And guys, I'll tell you, you think about this book today and you're like, what is this random old book? This book was epic when it came out. Everybody who is cultured, is a reader, is talking about this book. It's seen as groundbreaking, as uncovering things about human cultures and the history of human societies that had never been thought before. It's also seen as freeing people from a earlier kind of Victorian sense that society is pretty upstanding. You know, the modern world is very polished and clean cut, and we know where the edges of everything are, right? There's a very rational world. Frazer, and later Freud, we'll look at next week, suggests that beneath this veneer, this respectable picture of society, right? There are darker things, violent things, and that's what he traces in this book, The Golden Bough. So let's tell the story just for a couple of slides here, get a little sense of the drama of the book, right? Because there's a plot in this book, weirdly introduced at the beginning, returned to 20 volumes later. What's the plot? There's a grove. Grove is an opening in trees, right? It's near a lake called Nemi in central Italy. And in that grove, there is a temple, or the ruins of a temple, to the goddess Diana, right? The goddess of the hunt. People went to this temple in this grove in Italy for many years. It was a popular destination for pilgrims and for others. It was a lovely, restful, and crucial, civilized place, right? It's a temple. Religion is for nice, good people, right? Okay. But Roman poets say there is a second god of the temple, not just Diana, but Verbius, right? There's a tension. God opposing God, right? Friction is being introduced here. And this god, Verbius, was represented, had a representative, a man, in this case, who lived in the forest. And this man was called the King of the Wood. The wood here meaning the forest, right? It was his job to protect the temple. So we've introduced some of our characters. We have Diana, the goddess to whom the temple is dedicated, and we have the King of the Wood, right, who is a representative of this other god. Interesting. This King of the Wood, however, and this is how Frazer is setting up the story, did not just accede to the throne, right? He didn't just adopt or wasn't just nominated by somebody. He killed the previous king. He acquired his position by murder, according to the stories. Remarkable. He took the power of the previous king of the wood, and he could remain king only so long as his power was strong. When his power, the current king of the wood, was weakened, there would be a new claimant to the role of king of the wood, and he would kill the current king of the wood and assume that position, right? Would now represent that god, Verbius. This is symbolized in the book, and that's where the title comes from, by the golden bough. So there's a bough of a tree. It's like a branch of a tree, right? And it's golden in color, or yellow in color. And the idea is that whoever holds this bough, it's like a scepter, a symbol of the power of the king of the wood. Whoever holds that bough would enjoy the sexual favors of Diana, would have that kind of intense, even physical intimacy with the goddess to whom the temple was dedicated, and would rule the woodland, right? Would have the function of priest, would kind of govern that grove where the temple was located. Okay, so we've set up our story. Let's unpack the claim I've suggested already, that underneath the respectability there's something darker. Pals writes, Frazer's work points to an earlier, more brutal state of humanity lying just below the surface of societies that we think of as civilized. How, he asks, could there be a place as beautiful as the grove at Nemi, a temple and ground so loved by visitors for its peace and healing renewal, yet at the time so steeped in a heritage of savage violence? Guys, connect this with our kind of conception of the Victorian age, right? There's a sexual prudishness about it. That everybody's very buttoned up, starched collars, things like this, right? Okay. Underneath that society, people engaged in culture are beginning to say, there are forces, there are drives, there is violence, right, that is not apparent on the surface. And if you really want to understand society, it's not enough to be buttoned up and respectable, right? That is, Freud, repression, right? We're coming to that next week. But Frazer is leading the way on this through his story. So it's a weird kind of roundabout way of getting at it. But through this example of this grove and this old story of the King of the Wood, he's suggesting something that's relevant to culture at that time, right? This is not just that people are interested in the grove at Nemi, right? I mean, they're no more interested in that intrinsically than you are or I am, right? But they're certainly interested in the idea that that their society is not fully transparent about itself. Let's go to the theme of magic, which is really important in Frazer's book, and he's here building on the thinking of Tylor. Early peoples, Frazer argues, engaged in what he calls magical thinking. Magical thinking. This is a phrase that just entered the lexicon. Is it a lexicon? Entered currency, right? After his work, Joan Didion has a book called The Year of Magical Thinking from recent years, just about 10 years ago. That concept of magical thinking is from Frazer. What does that mean? Magical thinking is a belief that if I do one thing over here in a certain way, it might have a causal effect on another thing over here that is similar to it. I put on the slide a picture of a brain as a walnut. Right? For centuries, it was believed that if you eat walnuts, it's good for your brain. Right? Why? Because a walnut looks like a brain, right? And you might say today, oh, but ching, that's just silliness, right? But this was a pattern of thought that for countless millennia operated, according to Frazer and others, in human societies, right? He calls this sympathetic magic. There is a sympathy, right? Influence or contagiousness. He uses that term too. That one thing kind of catches in another thing and has an effect. On an earlier slide, we had a picture of what we call a voodoo doll, right? And what is that? If I do something to this doll that looks like, and I don't know, maybe has a piece of hair from or something, a person, then that person might suffer a consequence as a result of my action upon this doll, right? So that's the nature of sympathy here, one thing connected to another. The system of sympathies is strict, right? So in a magical world, if you do something to the doll, something's going to happen to the person. It's as definite as we understand today the operation of natural laws to be, right? There aren't exceptions. It's not like if I drop something, sometimes it'll fall and sometimes it won't. No, it's always going to fall, right? Magic, though, he says, is not just proto-science. He's going a little bit beyond what Tylor was doing in primitive culture here. Frazer is, yes, he's primarily engaged with what we believe, but he recognizes that those beliefs are connected with social power, right? And that's like the king of the wood, right? King is a position of power. That king protects the grove through his mastery of a certain kind of magical power. And that's an important advance on Tylor's thinking. However, lest we get too excited about magic, magic is not true, right? That's our that's our belief today as modern, rational, scientific thinking, clear-headed people. If there's a fantastic magic trick that a magician performs, we're going to ask, how did she do it? Right? We're not going to say, oh, she's channeling a cosmic power unknown to modern science. If she is, damn it, we want to know about that, right? But basically, magic is not true, and over time, as it fails in this case or that case, people have to come up with explanations. Well, why didn't that happen? Well, maybe the magician was flawed, or character problem, right? Or maybe the conditions were not auspicious. Always had to be some kind of explanation. There's a chain here that we're going to now look at, leading from magic to step 2, religion, to step 3, science. This is Frazer's evolutionism, right? Magic, he thinks, gives way to religion. Religion replaces magic, and the priest replaces the magician. He thinks this is actually an advance in human society. Why is this an advance? He wants to emphasize the contrast. We might think that magic and religion are kind of similar. The priest elevates the host in the Catholic Mass, and it does a kind of magic. Not the case for Frazer. He thinks that magic is impersonal and constant and universal. What do I mean? If I do one thing, it will have this effect all the time, right? There's not some kind of intervening divine agency. It's a way of human beings manipulating nature in an early, again, kind of proto-scientific way. This is one reason why magic was always regarded with suspicion by the Christian churches because it's a way of, as it were, circumventing God's providential plan for the world, right? By manipulating nature and bringing off a result that might not be intended by God. And in this way, it is impious. It is prideful. What religion does, as distinct from magic, is introduce this personal agent, a god, multiple gods, right? And you can't just learn the formula and do the magic trick, as we call it, work the magic. You have to actually appeal to an agency. By agency here, I mean a person, a god. You have to convince the god to help you. So you pray, you ask the god, you give reasons, you make deals, right? For Frazer, he thinks this is actually a more accurate picture of our lives as human beings, because we don't always get what we want, right? Magic doesn't always work, and it's not always attributable to like some character flaw on the part of the magician or some inauspicious circumstance. Like, well, magic doesn't work because it's not true. And so he thinks that religion actually kind of opens up our curiosity about the world and our search for answers, because we don't know what God is going to do. We don't know what is necessarily going to happen. It brings about changes in society, this move from magic to religion, right? So now, as mentioned before, the priest, the one who can mediate between God and human beings, replaces the magician, the one who knows how to work, I'll call it again, the trick, right? For the magician, it's not really a trick, it's a very solemn kind of thing. And the reason I have this image on the slide here, magic and religion, he says, combine in the person of the king. And Pals concludes his discussion of Frazer in the main portion of the text in this way. The phrase is, the king is dead, long live the king. So when Queen Elizabeth II died, for example, the queen is dead, however, long live the king. Right? The old belief here, and Frazer is looking back at earlier societies. It continues in England, maybe as a survival in Tylor's sense. There's a certain power, authority, sovereignty about the monarch, king, queen, whatever, right? When the monarch dies, the body of that person dies, the power that was invested in that person, in that body, in that spirit of the monarch, is passed on to the next monarch. This legitimates the next monarch, right? Charles in England isn't just some guy who popped up, right? The old theory, and again, this is something that we might feel very distant today about, the old theory is that Charles has somehow inherited, we call it the mantle, right? Inherited Frazer would call it the magical power of, in this case, Charles's mother, right? The power of the monarch of Great Britain has passed from one individual human person to a different individual human person. But there's a consistency of role between those two and a consistency of power. So what Frazer thinks is, we have moved beyond religion today to science in just the way that previously we had moved beyond magic to religion. Science, he thinks, is almost a return to magic, right? We've introduced that uncertainty. That's been a very fecund, productive uncertainty, right? But we have learned that, in his view, the personal agents, gods, who were at the center of that, simply do not exist in the same way we earlier learned that magic does not work, right? So, like Tylor, operation of our rational mind that is consistent across time has led us to return to an account of the world that is explained in terms of general and impersonal principles. We call these natural laws, right? The laws of science. Once you know these laws, you, as a scientist, can develop knowledge of the world and through technology manipulate the world in just the way that a magician did in previous ages, right? So when we say technology is a kind of magic, That's not just an idle phrase. I mean, it really is, in Frazer's view at least, uh, the manipulation of knowable general rules in pursuit of a certain kind of outcome, right? So a rain dance produces rain is just the same as, the principles of, I don't know, electrical engineering and quantum mechanics produce the iPhone, right? Knowing the principles, we can produce the outcome. And Frazer, as we've said, certainly regarded his own view as fully scientific based on all the evidence that we referred to earlier. So he saw himself standing at the edge of this development. This is our last slide, guys. Critique. Hal's helpfully at the end of each of his chapters includes a little section on critique. 3 points. First, Tylor and Frazer especially often link pieces of evidence in a way that's kind of dubious, right? They're not really paying attention to social context. So if I have someone in Sumatra doing X, and I have someone in Russia doing X-ish, right? Something similar, I might say, look, there's a universal human tendency to do X, because even in these two very disparate cultures that don't have any documentable relation to each other, they did X, right? Now, you might gather from your own training in the social and natural sciences that that's not really how it works, right? That's not enough evidence or the right kind of evidence to draw that kind of conclusion. So people look at Tylor and Frazer today. I mean, it's very important historically to understand their work, and I hope you have found it interesting to learn about it. But these are not theories that tend to be kind of just straightforwardly accepted today. People wouldn't say, "Oh, well, I'm really devotee of James Frazer." Second point of criticism, the evolution thing, right? Just because something comes before something else, how can we know that there's some kind of like causal connection between the two? I mean, this is the difference between correlation and causation, right? So A happens and then B happens. That's good to know. But I don't know from simply that sequence of events that A caused B. I don't know that an earlier form of religion or religious belief caused a later form. And this is the second point of criticism. And finally, this is probably the big one, and I can speak as someone who spent some time in circles where folks are studying religion. There's a lot of suspicion today, I think rightly, about the approach to studying religion that focuses on belief. Right? The religion is a kind of list of true beliefs reached, in this case, rationally about the world. So I believe in a God because I observed a dead body, and that dead body is clearly lacking some kind of spirit that it had before, and so QED, I prove there is a spirit. Religion tends today, or the study of religion tends today, to focus on other dimensions of religion, social dimensions of religion, practices, right? Things that are not simply a matter of making kind of proto-scientific, or we might say today unscientific, claims about things. I think religion itself, or we should say, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, whomever, they themselves would not regard their religion as simply a matter of a list of things they believe about the world that they arrived at rationally. And so especially Tylor's, but also Frazer's emphasis on the intellectual dimension of religion is seen as somehow lacking. Friends, thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed learning about Tylor and Frazer. Again, these are the two first major theories that we'll be looking at in the course. Next week, Sigmund Freud.